Hello, everyone, and welcome to the return of the Australia Institute's Unparliamentary webinar series. I'm Glenn Connley, Senior Media Advisor here at the Australia Institute, and I'm coming to you today from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. We're going to keep things tight today. We'll try to squeeze in a few of your questions, so please type your questions into the Q&A box and feel free to upvote other people's questions. Let's get straight to it. The Albanese government has an expanded majority in the 48th Parliament following the May 3 federal election. 12 weeks after polling day, MPs have finally returned to the capital and parliamentary combat has resumed. I'm delighted to introduce today's guest. Although as the old cliche goes, she really needs no introduction. Michelle Grattan is the most respected journalist in the parliamentary press gallery. She's the Chief Political Correspondent at The Conversation and Professorial Fellow at the University of Canberra. Michelle Grattan, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
Michelle, by my count, your first parliament that you covered was the 27th Parliament, led by Liberal PM Billy McMahon. That's 21 parliaments and 13 prime ministers ago. So when all the ceremonial stuff ended and question time returned last Tuesday, what were you feeling? Was it a sense of here we go again, or was there optimism for the new parliament?
Well, I think a bit of both. Obviously, this parliament is distinct in terms of the huge Labor majority, and everyone was remarking about how the Labor benches were spilling across the chamber and the opposition was looking pretty woebegone. At the start of every parliament, or at least recent parliaments, there's always been talk of better behaviour, kinder, gentler parliaments and so on. In my experience, never happens, but it was notable that the Speaker, Milton Dick, was trying to give a few lectures to the MPs, especially presumably with the newcomers in mind. They're on their best behaviour at the moment, but never last too long, that he wasn't going to tolerate too much bad behaviour.
We'll get to a bit of news of the day in a second. Can I start with your take on the dynamic of the new parliament? You've mentioned the big increased majority. The Greens lost a few House of Reps seats, but now have the sole balance of power in the Senate. We have a much weakened coalition reviewing the bulk of its policy platform. It's got the Nats making things difficult, potentially backtracking on net zero by 2050. If I could frame the question this way, how relevant is the Liberal National Coalition in 2025?
Well, in terms of the overall situation, it's not very relevant at all. You'll remember during the election campaign, even many of us thought that most likely the outcome would be a Labor minority government. And in that case, of course, the crossbench becomes very relevant. The opposition becomes much more relevant than if you've got a majority government. But if I can put it this way, I think that the point at the moment is that the opposition's relevance is to itself. Is it going to be able to hang together and resolve in an electorally acceptable way the major issues it faces? Now, the issue it faces at the moment most immediately is, of course, the future of the net zero commitment. And that is particularly important because the opposition generally, and even the Liberal Party, they're split on this question. If they jettison net zero, then I think it will send a very bad message for the opposition to the urban seats that it needs to win. I think as things stand at the moment, it looks as though the Nationals are moving to drop net zero. The Liberals are divided, but the numbers even there seem to be changing against net zero. So the opposition, while it has to play the parliamentary game, and I think it played it reasonably actually in this past fortnight, it asked the right questions in question time. They weren't silly, but of course they were just brushed off by the government, which is certainly got its tail very high in the air at the moment. But the opposition's main challenge is itself just now.
What about Susan Lee's position? Before we consider even her performance, history sort of tells us after a big election defeat like this, it's a kind of a sitting duck position. And then you wrote about, MPs freelancing, the likes of Sarah Henderson and Jane Hume yesterday. We've still got this stuff with the Nationals and net zero that you've just discussed. How difficult is her situation? Will she last?
Well, most people think, and I think it's a fair bet with all the caveats that one takes risk predicting the future, but most people think this is going to be a two-term situation for the opposition. It's not going to be able to win next term. And I think that history tells us the numbers, factional numbers in the party tell us that Susan Lee is very unlikely to be able to see out those two terms. The party, in terms of her support's divided between the moderates and some other supporters on the one hand, who got her across the line, and the Conservatives who preferred Angus Taylor on the other. And I think that you will see pressure on her leadership at some point. Also, if you're looking into the distant future, she's in her 60s now, so put another 6 years onto that, and it adds to her problems to think she could go to the election after next. Some Liberals might be thinking of the scenario that at the next election, if they could get Josh Frydenberg back into Kooyong, that would give an option for leadership in the next term. But that's a big if, of course. And again, we come back to this net zero. If the Liberals decided to dump net zero, what are the chances of regaining Kooyong? I wouldn't have thought very great.
Yeah, or any teal seat for that matter. Could I turn to foreign affairs? Before Parliament resumed, the PM went to China, and the opposition says this is a sign the government sort of is wrongly putting the relationship with China ahead of the US. They led on this in question time for the first 2 days of Parliament, saying, why can't the Prime Minister get a meeting with Donald Trump? Do you think Anthony Albanese is desperate to meet Trump, or just happy to bide his time, having seen what a couple of world leaders have experienced in visits to the Oval Office?
I think he'd prefer a meeting that wasn't in the Oval Office itself, because the Australians are very aware of how that can go unscripted, and certainly I think the Albanese government likes scripts when it can get them. The decision today, just a little while before we're talking here, that Australia will get a tariff of 10%, will be on the lowest level of tariffs, I think has been very encouraging for the government, because only a few countries are on that level, and there were fears it could be worse. So that's very much a plus, I think, for the government. It's not entirely clear to me how desperate or not the Prime Minister is to get that meeting with Trump, but I think most experts in this area recognise that that meeting, even though it holds all sorts of unpredictable elements, is important, that it does need to happen, and it needs to happen as soon as possible, because the alliance needs to be reaffirmed. Even more importantly, a personal relationship needs to be built up between Albanese and Trump. And I think that the chances of a meeting going bad are actually pretty low. That doesn't mean that the Prime Minister couldn't find himself put on the spot over the US pressure for us to increase defence expenditure or other issues. course, Trump is unpredictable, but I don't think that that unpredictable element really should be the main consideration. I think the important thing to get the meeting done, to establish the personal relationship, to tick off, reference the various areas that need to be discussed.
Is your gut feeling it'll happen and happen maybe by the end of this year?
Oh, I think it has to happen by the end of this year because they cross paths at various international gatherings, and it would be pretty bizarre in that case if there couldn't be at least a meeting on the sidelines. But really, desirably, I think it should be a meeting in Washington, if possible.
Look, foreign affairs may fall into this, but there's been a lot of commentary about the government's sort of lack of big policy ambition, about playing it safe, doing the least it can do to fulfill its election promises, upsetting the least number of people. How do you view this sort of commentary? Could it be political genius on Anthony Albanese's part, or potentially a wasted opportunity for meaningful reform?
I think there's a lot of pressure on the government to do big things in this second term, and it will be interesting to see how the Economic Reform Summit roundtable works out later in August. I think the thing to watch there will be to what extent the ambitions of the Treasurer and the Prime Minister are in line, because basically Jim Chalmers wants to get bigger things done. Anthony Albanese is more cautious and more attentive to putting the emphasis on the delivery of election promises. And of course, we saw in this first week, the legislation that was passed was all about election promises, like the relieving student debt and so on. So there is a question of whether the Prime Minister will be a restraining hand on the bigger agenda that Labor is under pressure to produce and that some ministers, notably the Treasurer, would like to undertake.
Do you get a sense that, I mean, coming off the back of a huge election victory, maybe not, but is there a Hawke Keating situation brewing here in terms of sort of long-term leadership and Chalmers' ambitions?
I do get that sense. That would be disputed by some observers, I would note. But this always tends to arise. And of course, we saw with the same with John Howard and Peter Costello, even though that Peter Costello never got to get to the leadership, make the challenge, but he was always ambitious, and there was always that tension between the two of them, and that grew over time. We saw it dramatically in the Hawke Keating case. I think at the moment what we're seeing is the very, very early stages of that sort of tension relationship. There's no doubt that Jim Chalmers is extremely ambitious, both for what he wants to do and for the top job in the end, but he's seen a lot of history. He did his PhD on Paul Keating. So he knows that for him, the best way is to have a good relationship with the Prime Minister, to have as much cooperation as possible. He's always praising the Prime Minister. But at some point, that tension becomes greater, becomes more overt. The big majority that the Prime Minister won at the election means that all that's been put back a bit in time and pushed down under the surface. But I do think that that's the way it usually goes, and that's the way it may well go.
Just to come back to policy, you say there's some pressure for the government to have big targets. I heard you talking to Chris Bowen on your podcast last week. He says the clean energy transition is on target. who is going to put the pressure on the government to go bigger on climate change? Obviously, you're going to have an opposition potentially turning away from net zero by 2050, or at least the Nats. Is it the Greens? Is it the Teals? And can they succeed?
Well, just firstly on what Chris Bowen said, a number of people would dispute that target, that 2030 target, is on track. There's speculation that we won't get there. But we're about to move on to the 2035 target, which has got to be submitted in September. It was, of course, the government delayed considering this until after the election. It says it hasn't had its advice yet from the Climate Change Authority. The preliminary work of that authority suggested a target between 65% and 75%. And I think the argument will be whether we go for the lower range or the upper range. Who will put the pressure on? Well, there are a whole lot of climate groups that will be arguing for an ambitious target. I spoke on the podcast this week to crossbencher Allegra Spender. She was arguing for the most ambitious target that was feasible, although she did qualify that by saying that, you know, she'd take note of the latest Climate Change Authority advice when it comes, and that'll be published. But climate change remains a big issue. It remains an issue in those teal seats. So there's, and the teals are themselves mobilising on it. So there's pressure all around for it, but for an ambitious target. But by the same token, there's pressure from business on the other side not to go too hard, and the government will be aware that it can't compromise the economic side of the picture by just going for broke. The other element in all this is that we still don't know whether we can host that COP next year, which the government wants to host in Adelaide. That's a big deal, huge thing with tens of thousands, 70, 80,000 people involved, present. So it'll take some organising. And I think the government, I certainly got the impression from Chris Bowen on that podcast, the government's pretty impatient to get a decision. We're up against Turkey. He says we've got the votes, but he also says it's a very opaque process, and the loser is supposed to just retreat in a gentlemanly fashion, but there's no sign of Turkey doing that. So that's another factor, perhaps, in how ambitious we are in that 2035 target.
So staying on the Greens and Teals, we've got a couple of questions from Jay and Gavin, both looking at the role of the Greens and the Teals and the role they can play in putting pressure on the government, particularly in climate. I heard you chat with Larissa Waters a couple of weeks ago. She sort of says the government has a couple of choices here. You can have big targets and we'll work constructively with you, or you can have little targets, tinker around the edges, and you're going to have to do deals with the coalition. Is it that simple in terms of not just environmental policy? She talks about inequality and other things, that work with us and we'll help with a big agenda, or stick to the old way of tinkering around the edges and do deals with them?
Well, on the target, the 2035 target, I don't know, I might be wrong on this, but I don't think you even need legislation. Now, the government chose to legislate the 2030 target, but that was its choice. It wanted to make a point when it came in at the 2022 election. But I think they can just set the target without legislation. On other things, I think they will pick and choose. They will go with the Greens on some things, and we'll see a deal soon, I imagine, on that superannuation legislation to increase the tax on big accounts and to tax unrealised capital gains. the Greens want changes. I think there'll be some compromise there. But I don't think that they will want to be held hostage to the Greens more than they need to be. The Greens, of course, played hardball in the last Parliament, and that didn't necessarily serve the Greens well in the lower house, where they lost 3 of their 4 seats, and including their leader. But the Greens, as I think you mentioned earlier, do have the sole balance of power now, so the government has a bit of an easier task. It needed the Greens last time in the Senate, but it also needed 1 or 2 of the other crossbenchers. But I think it'll be an issue by issue thing in terms of negotiating legislation.
I want to go to a question from Jackie. As with the ALP-DLP split, which kept Labor out of power until Whitlam, will the LNP potential split over climate change and renewables keep the LNP out of power until catastrophic impacts accelerate even further?
Well, I think it could keep the coalition out of power a long time. As I said before, I think it's out of power for a couple of terms, barring some miracle from its point of view, as it is. But really, this is a crisis for the coalition, not just over climate change, but over the fact that they're now 2 divided blocs. Now, they've always been somewhat divided between the Liberals and Nationals, but the Liberals themselves are fundamentally split between the urban-facing Conservative side of the party, which has almost no urban seats, incidentally, but it's tuned into the urban areas on the one hand, and the Conservatives who are more located in the regions, outer areas of the big cities and so on, and who are really not going to want the party to adopt policies that appeal to the seats now occupied by the teals, which the Liberals need to win back if they're to win power.
So we're talking about differences within the coalition, but Labor's not without differences either. I want to ask you about the recognition of Palestine. I mean, and in some ways this is similar to action on climate. The Labor rank and file want certain actions from the government, but the government is far more cautious when it comes to these things, and probably the recognition of Palestine is the most stark here. You've written about the Prime Minister's history of support for Palestine. Do you think recognition is a matter of when, not if? Will that be soon? And will that be because the government does want to represent what the Labor rank and file and voters generally want?
Well, the Treasurer this week effectively announced that it was a matter of when, not if. And I think what's happened here is that internationally the ground has shifted. I think the government has wanted international cover on this issue, and I think it still wants that. The timing is quite uncertain, and the Prime Minister really is not willing to put a time frame around this, although there is speculation it could be when he goes to the UN Leaders' Week in New York in September. That would seem logical. It might be before that, though. It might be in the run-up to that September week. It depends also, I think, on what is actually happening in that conflict. And of course, there are not only the particular players, but the United States involved in that whole diplomacy. And it depends on just how other countries play out on this issue. We've seen a lot of quick movement, with France saying it'll recognise, with the UK and Canada flagging recognition, but with conditions, not clear when or whether those conditions will be met. So it's a very moving situation, and maybe even the government doesn't really know exactly where and when it's going to land.
Look, I've got a question from Susan, and she probably echoes the thoughts of lots of people seeing the scenes coming out of Gaza every day. Recognition is one thing, it's long term. What can the ALP, the government, do right now to stop the genocide, to stop the starvation, to stop the misery in Gaza, if anything?
Well, I think the point here is Australia can do absolutely nothing apart from obviously sending more aid. It could do that, but that's not going to stop the killing or end the conflict. Would be a very good thing to do, but really we are, even though this is consuming a lot of debate in Australia now and has had massive domestic consequences, certainly testing cohesion, producing anti-Semitism, producing a lot of feeling in the Muslim community. We are not a player. We have no direct influence in this conflict at all.
I want to ask you about something where we are a player, that is Orcus. Certainly our polling and what we hear from Labor rank and file is Australians don't especially want Orcus. Do you get the sense that there are some within the government, potentially really senior people, sort of secretly hoping the UK and US reviews of Orcus and potentially one here could actually kill this off?
I don't get that feeling, but I do think that probably some in the government are not fans of Orcus. But the thing is, you'll remember, of course, that this was embraced basically for political reasons instantly once the Morrison government announced it, embraced by Labor, I mean, which did not want to make itself a target on this issue. I think the thing about Orcus is that having got into it, the difficulties and implications of getting out of it, frankly, would be pretty great. So whether Orcus in the end will serve Australia well or badly will be a matter of a very long time to make judgments. There are people who say we'll never get the submarines from America, that it entangles us too much in American conflicts, which of course historically we've been entangled in before and now in some cases regret that. But we are here with Orcus, so to try and retreat from it would be, I think, very costly at a whole lot of levels. So the necessity is to make it work as best we can.
Thanks, Michelle. Oh, look, I'm mindful it's 29 minutes past 11. I've got one last question, and this reflects a couple of questions coming in talking about the two-party system. If anything, this election showed us something we've said for a while. There's no such thing as a safe seat. So many election races are not two parties between the two major parties. Two-party preferred is so hard to read into now. Watching election night, the old two-party contests just don't add up. Is it time we stopped looking at Australian politics through this two-party prism, that we stopped, as journalists, every time the government does something, we go straight to the opposition for their response? Maybe we go to the Greens, Indies or others.
Well, yes and no. I think we've got to recognise all those things that you said, that people are very distrustful of institutions at the moment. That's a long-term trend, and that includes parties, especially the major parties. I don't think the major parties serve the country as well as they should. That's a whole debate, an interesting debate for another time. However, we've reached the point where the two-party system has lost a lot of its support, but we haven't moved completely to another model, and where we are, it may be stable for the immediate future. A lot of this perhaps depends on what we were talking about before, what happens to the Liberals. If the Liberals manage to get themselves back into better order and are a strong party, that will reinforce the two-party system. That's a big if, of course. But while I know many people, and probably many people watching this, are fans of a much more a multi-player parliament, I would argue that while it's good to have some strong crossbenchers, there are virtues also in having two strong groups, a government and an opposition, which is strong and which can get the government of the day can get things done. We're talking about this government being able to get more done because it has a bigger majority. If you have fragmentation, I think it can be a handbrake on action on major reforms. Now, as I say, that would be a contested view, but I think it's a view that has some backing and is worth considering.
Michelle, we're out of time. I want to thank you so much for giving us so much of your time. I know you have work to do. We could keep talking for a long time, but it's been a great privilege speaking with you. Thank you very much.
Good to be with you.
And that's it. Thank you all for tuning in. Thanks for those who posted questions. Apologies to those whose questions we didn't get to. Remember, you could subscribe to the Australia Institute on YouTube, where you can see all our podcasts and webinars. In fact, check out all our online activities, op-eds, media releases, events, and of course, all the research which keeps this place ticking on our website, theaustraliainstitute.org.au. We'll be back with another very special unparliamentary guest during the next parliamentary sitting period. Bye for now.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.